Do you believe PRC industries that directly contribute to the development of technologies for the People's Liberation Army should have access to U.S. capital and our capital markets?
No, no, I don't. It's one thing to think about the Belt and Road Initiative. It's another thing if you're handing somebody the belt to tie around your neck. We on the venture capital side at Lux and many of our peer firms are trying to do our part to provide the private capital so that we can take the risks on emerging startups. There are companies like Anduril that are all defense focused, and Saildrone and Primer that touch every aspect, air, land, sea, space, subsea. The important thing is being able to make sure that the funding is there to support the long-term horizons of these companies. Venture capital firms typically are 10 years in duration, and we're able to make a decade-long bet knowing that we're going to take a shot and we're not sure if it's going to hit the rim or be an air ball or be a three-pointer for a very long period of time. Government has to parry with us and do the same. Long-term funding, long-term investment in science produces long-term results. People that might have invested a decade ago in China might have been doing it under a reasonable inducement or belief that this was an economy that was growing, that technology would do like it's done in the rest of the world, produce more democracy and freedom and choice and options for people to express their creativity and genius. It's been very clear over the past few years that it's the antithesis of that these have become tools of suppression and surveillance and government capture, as was well elucidated. So I think that the people that made these investments some time ago probably did it with good intent, and now you're in illiquid investments that they're stuck in, and they have to make the reputational concerns about what they do in the future, and they've got to figure out how do they not lose their own investors' money by getting out now. Anybody that's making new investments, I think, is making a massive mistake. Most important is being that shining beacon on the hill and the American dream that people are attracted to. People are not knocking on the door to get into Shenzhen. They are knocking on the door to get into
We've got
Silicon Valley.
that, but what we have is an immigration system that doesn't allow them to stay. So what do we need to do to reform that?
I would recommend stapling a visa or a green card to anybody that's graduating with a serious advanced degree and has to stay here for a period of time to make sure that the technology and the know-how that they're getting is remaining here on our shores. On the human capital side of this, of the scientists, I want to give one just simple example of one individual that I think affects us all. There's an individual who was trained here in the United States, worked at Texas Instruments for 25 years, and felt like he hit a bamboo ceiling, and felt that whether it was because of ethnicity or racism or certain views, that he was not going to ascend higher. And Taiwan said, why don't you come here and build your company and we'll give you money. That individual was Morris Chang, and the company was Taiwan Semiconductor, TSMC. It could have been Texas Semiconductor Manufacturing Corp. And I hope that we don't make that mistake and are able to keep some of the best and brightest here on our shores so that they can develop the next TSMC here. You know, it's interesting. This, to me, was a bipartisan issue. I was privileged when, in the early days of material science and nanotechnology, President Bush II had invited me into the Oval Office, signed in $1 billion a year. You had Newt Gingrich at the time, who was actually calling for a tripling of the NIH budget. And I would love to see that be a bipartisan issue, to see that science is not a waste of money. It's a critical investment in our future. I think the more money we can spend on science, and I realize that budgets are a difficult thing of where you get the money from.
Just clear, I mean, we got a large budget. I mean, we can find a way to reverse that in the final passage. So your recommendation to the Congress would be, do not cut the NIH budget, correct?
I would not cut, however.
Okay,
I
want to give
it's important. I would make sure that we really bias towards young scientists. As it relates to the idea of technological sovereignty, this is really in two forms. The first is making sure that the companies that we're investing in and our existing strongest companies are not solely dependent on a single supplier. And in many cases, as we've heard, whether it's batteries or certain other key components, China has been very strategic over the past decade plus of securing the raw materials and metals and rare earth minerals to be able to not only capture them, but then assemble them and make the world dependent upon them. So diversifying into allied nations is important. That's going to take time. It's a complex issue. That's number one. The second piece of technological sovereignty is making sure that our peer country allies are actually sourcing and choosing American technologies. And there are lots of instances where I would see China actually making great headway in wanting to export their technology and successfully doing so. And those countries are going to have to ask themselves a question. What kind of country do you want to be? Do you want to be one that is free and technologically sovereign and independent, or do you want to be one that is dependent on the CCP? Without naming names, there are celebrities, there are actors, there are entertainers, there are lots of people who understand the economic value of being able to sell into China. And I believe that's why many investors went in there over the past decade, and rationally. As it has become evident of the nefarious and insidious and suppressive means that the CCP has, people have to revisit that. And so when you see an actor taking a knee and speaking in Mandarin for calling Taiwan a country, or you see athletes refusing to criticize foreign human rights injustices, It is great to want people to sit in the seats. It is great to want people in the theaters. It is great to want people in the arena sitting down. But as an influential American, you also have to be standing up for what makes us great, and that is our moral righteousness over the rest of the world, doing the right thing. This is a huge opportunity where NIH funding, NSF funding goes into basic science, particularly around biotech. You look at the innovation that we've had in CRISPR. You had Jennifer Doudna out west, ultimately winning the Nobel Prize. You had Feng Zhang, who's a Chinese scientist now in the US at Broad and MIT. And we've started companies around him, and we want him here. We want him developing those kinds of technologies. In biotech in particular, I think that this is an area that requires a lot of attention. China has something, or lacks something rather, that we have, and because of that, they are advantaged. And the thing that they lack is the ethics and regulatory apparatus that we have. And that ethics and regulatory apparatus can slow down biotech. And so I actually think that there's an opportunity here to fund the basic science, make sure that biotech gets to market. They also have another advantage which was named, which was the indifference to human rights. Now, there has been over the recent months a huge fad and excitement around the diet drugs. I'm sure we all know people that are taking these. Well, imagine in a year or 2 or 5 that there's a cure for Alzheimer's. Everybody would be giving it to their mother, et cetera. But what if we found out that that was tested on 1 million Uyghurs? What would be the morality of that? I grew up in a Jewish household, and I had 2 words that I heard all the time: never again. It is happening again. And as people have said, indifference to injustice is the gate to hell. We should not be indifferent about the human rights abuses that are happening there. We should have more competitive science here. We should fund it, and you should allow the private market to commercialize it.
Mr. Wolf, can you describe for this committee the differences in the ways investments in advanced and emerging technologies occur in the United States versus the PRC?
You know, it's a messy system here, and that messiness is its beauty. We want, there it's a directed system that says this is what we're going to develop, or we're going to steal, and we're going to build it. Here, we want free, undirected research. You want pure experimentation. You want irreverent thinkers, people reaching into each other's other disciplines and coming up with big ideas, and then you have the private market with the greedy incentive to want to make money and commercialize these technologies. Starts with a foundation of undirected basic science research, people that can tinker and experiment and come up with ideas, be criticized by their ego-driven peer competitors in scientific review, and then that gets published, and people like us spot it and say, we want to start a company with that. We think that we can build the next Genentech or the next Google. And so the free market should be left to do its thing. The state-directed is a inferior model. We should not copy China. China is trying to copy us, and they don't have the culture to be able to do it. Capital markets should be as free as possible so that people can take risks, lose their money if they're wrong or unlucky, make money if they're right or lucky. We do want lots of basic science funding because the free market won't fund that. We won't fund undirected research. That's a national asset. We want to invest in that asset so that it can then be transferred to the private equity firms, the public equity firms, the venture capitalists like us, who have a great motivation to want to turn that into profit. There's about 3,000 mom and pop shops, which basically are today's Freedom Forge, the ability to manufacture critical components for aerospace and defense companies, the cutting edge ones from SpaceX to Blue Origin to Lockheed and Raytheon and beyond. We had an entrepreneur who actually said, you know, why don't we roll up some of these groups? His name is Chris Power. He's a great patriot. He's Australian. Came to the U.S., started a company called Hadrian in California, and we're an investor, as are some other VCs. And he has one mission, which is I want to build the machine that builds the machines. He wants to have a cutting-edge, autonomous factory, and he's building it. And the pipeline and of customer demand is off the charts. I'm grateful for entrepreneurs like that who identified a problem, and he is recreating that new generation of Freedom's Forge. I think it's critical for our competitiveness and for the defense industry. Nuclear, I think, is critical, not again for proliferation, but nuclear reactors. I don't think people really appreciate this. And I know, as I said earlier, we speak about AI and biotech and quantum. I think a vector or spotlight should be on nuclear because I think it's really serious, and here's why. US went from 104 to 93 reactors. We're down 10%. China went from 2 to 25 to 55, and they're on their way to 150. 5% of their electricity is produced by nuclear. It'll be 20, which approaches ours, but it'll be a much larger population. But that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is they're beginning to export the technology. And not for nuclear proliferation, but for creating dependency. You think about all the countries on the coasts of the African continent, all of the countries in South America and Central America. And the reason, as was said earlier by Congressman, that the idea that something is cheaper sometimes makes it more attractive. The Georgia plant that was done in nuclear here in the US recently, $25 billion. That's about $11.5, $12 billion or so per gigawatt. China is producing nuclear for $2 billion a gigawatt. So that's a huge contrast. If you're a foreign country, China could easily come in and say, we will build it for you, we'll finance it for you, and then, by the way, we've got you hooked for the next few decades on dependency on fuel and maintenance, et cetera. From there, you can imagine a speculating future where you're proximate to seawater. You can do desalination. You've got water resources and water wars. China's already doing that in Pakistan. I think we have to get our act together on helping advance entrepreneurship, free market enterprise in nuclear. Again, I call it elemental energy, but this is an area that we should dominate. And as you noted with Westinghouse, the AP1000, and many other reactors with a lot of other history, these should be the ones that the world is buying, not Chinese nuclear reactors.